Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for today's presentation, Non-Conforming Building Products, an introduction to NCBP. I would like to begin today's webinar by acknowledging the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to lands, water and communities. Here in West End, I acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara people, but I also acknowledge that we may have a number of people joining us from other regions of Queensland. I pay my respects to elders past and present who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. I recognise their valuable contributions to Australian society and also extend that acknowledgement to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to the Australian Institute of Architects, the Board of Architects Queensland, the Association of Consulting Architects, and the Architects Small Practice Group for sharing this with all their associates. It's greatly appreciated. My name is Daniel DeSavia and I will be your MC for this presentation. Before we get started, I just have a couple of housekeeping matters to attend to. So first up, our post-webinar survey. So for the QBCC to continue on our educative journey for events like these webinars, we do need your help. So after the presentation, you'll receive an email survey seeking your feedback and assistance. We strongly encourage you to please take the time and respond and complete the survey. This will help provide us with information that will support us with our future initiatives and ensure future presentations will be presented in a manner that is productive and educative for you. If you'd like us to do things differently, potentially cover a different topic, or there was things that you did like and want more of, please let us know. We want our webinars to be interesting and engaging, and this will only ever happen with your feedback. So please use the opportunity to provide your feedback and help us make these better for everyone. If you have any questions for today's webinar, please send them through via the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. I'll be monitoring any questions that you may ask. We encourage you to send them through as soon as you think of them. So if you think of anything, please ask them and we'll endeavour to answer as many questions as we can during the designated question period. There are a large number of people with us today, so just bear in mind we may not get to your question. We did have quite a few people asking questions at registration stage, so we will answer those questions first. But if we don't get to answer your question, we strongly encourage you to follow us up. Either you can do that via your association, who may be able to collect the questions, submit them to us for a response, and that can be distributed back to you. Or alternatively, you may be wanting to contact us direct, which you can do. Our details are on the QBCC website on the NCBP page, and will also be given at the end of the presentation. There will be some interactive polls throughout the presentation today, so we strongly encourage you to interact, give them a shot and answer. It's not a test, they're not recorded. It's purely for your immediate sort of education and feedback. This webinar will also be recorded. So if you'd like to revisit this webinar, or you potentially know someone who couldn't join us today and you want to pass it on, you will be able to do this. This will be shared on the QBCC YouTube page. Just bear in mind, it may take some time to upload. There's a bit of editing and compressing and upload speeds, all that sort of plays into it. So just keep an eye out for it on the QBCC YouTube page. I've been with the Queensland Building and Construction Commission since November 2022. I'm an auditor for non-conforming building products. I have been a licensed building certifier for 8 years with 16 years industry experience working with state and private practice. Our presenter today is Zane Russell. Zane has been with the QBCC since January 2020. He is a licensed building certifier with 30 years experience working for local and state government and in private practice. Zane will cover with you today what is a non-conforming building product, safe compliance and representation, duties and required information. He'll go through some case scenarios, and then we'll open it up at the end for some questions. I'd like to pass it over to you now, Zane. Please go ahead.
Thanks for that, Dan. Okay, g'day everyone. Rightio, just find the mouse here, he's disappeared on me. So before we begin, thanks for everyone for coming along and taking your part in the NCBP chain of responsibility seriously. So today we aim to provide with information to help improve or to reinforce your understanding about duties under the Queensland NCBP laws. Oops. So what is a non-conforming building product? Good to see technology works well, doesn't it? So my colleague's just adding in a bit of a poll there. So just having a look at the polls that's coming up for what is a non-conforming building product. seeing what sort of information that they've got. Okay, so couple of options you've got there. Is it combustible? Is it the wrong colour? Architects would think that, maybe. Is it not safe, non-compliant or misrepresented? Is it not properly installed or doesn't comply with the NCC? Well, getting a few answers. Doesn't comply with the NCC seems to be the most popular. That is one of the answers. Yes, that is correct. Okay. So we'll start by going on with a little bit about the NCBP legislation. So the legislation, which my colleagues are sticking a link into the chat for you now so you can find it easily. So the legislation is in Part 6A of the QBCC Act, and that commenced back in November 2017, so been going for about 6 years now. That part establishes what we call a chain of responsibility and imposes positive duty on people to make sure that building products are not an NCBP. It's divided into 3 parts, and those 3 parts relating around the product, as we call it, information and duties. So the first part is what is non-conforming building product, which most people have said doesn't comply with the NCC. The second part is about information that needs to accompany a building product. And the third part is in relation to the duties of executive officers. Now, an executive officer, for your information, is someone who's in control of management decisions for an entity, and that can include someone like the director, company secretary, could be the CEO, could also be a manager, so a compliance person that's in charge of the product things. So the first thing that we need to look at is the definitions, as we all live and die by definitions when you're dealing with legislation. You'll notice there the definitions of the building product is up on the screen there, and there are some underlined portions. Those underlined portions are defined terms under section 74AA, and I encourage you to make yourself aware of those definitions as you're having a review of the legislation. One of the really important ones is intended use. So definition of an NCBP. We explain it as it can't jump the 3 hurdles for NCBP. First thing, it's not safe, doesn't meet the relevant regulatory provisions, it's misrepresented or doesn't do what it's intended to do. If one of those 3 things happens, then you might end up like my mate here behind bars. Okay, so let's have a look at what is safe, compliance and representation. Safe, it isn't and won't be safe. What does that mean? That the risk of injury to persons has been removed as far as practicable, and if it's not practicable, you've minimised it. What would be an example of that? Well, later on, we're in the case scenarios, we will talk about a lift in a residential building. And what do you think of a lift that doesn't have a door on it that someone could fall out of? Would you consider that to be safe? Would you specify one of those? The next part is compliance. That's compliance with the, as we call it, the relevant regulatory provisions. And there's the definition of relevant regulatory provisions. So my colleagues are just sticking up some links there to the Building Act, the Plumbing and Drainage Act, and the NCC volumes 1, 2, and 3, which are all applicable for NCBP. So how is the NCC called up? Well, that's through the Building Act under Section 30, where it calls up the building assessment provisions, and that's where the NCC and the QDC are linked for Queensland. For plumbing and drainage matters, that's Section 9 under the Plumbing and Drainage Act, and that calls up the code requirements, so it calls up Plumbing Code of Australia, and which also does, the wastewater code and those other QDC matters that are related to plumbing. One of the important things to remember for the relevant regulatory provisions under the Plumbing and Drainage Act for non-conforming building products is Section 65, which requires that a plumber can only install a thing that is watermarked. So it's quite simple. If a thing doesn't have a watermark, it's going to be an NCBP. What would be some examples that we could use for you guys as an architect for the building assessment provisions like that relate to NCBP? So using NCC 2022, have a look at, you're doing townhouses or commercial building and you're doing the separating walls. You'd be looking at A5, G5, fire resistance of building elements. Now for the DTS provisions, you'd be looking at specifications 1 and 2, which means you're looking for the fire test for a separating wall. That's something you should be getting a copy of. Okay, yep, we've mentioned that, the assessment provisions, and I'm sure you're all aware what the new icons for the NCC look like. So we get the big tick when we do that. Representation. So this is in relation to compliance for the product. There's a definition you can have a read of for yourself. So what might be a good example for a representation, or as we call it, a misrepresentation? So looking at vinyl planks in a wet area. So vinyl plank flooring being represented as suitable for wet area, you know, where they've got the lovely clawfoot bath in the Queenslander and they've got the vinyl planks slipping in underneath it. That wouldn't meet the DTS provisions, which call up AS 3740 due to it not allowing a sheet material. And if you're interested, have a look at part 2.4.3 B2. So if someone does that, that could be looked at as a misrepresentation. Now, representation can be made in lots of different ways. It could be by a brochure, it could be by an advertisement, it could be by the salesperson saying, look, this product can do that. The vinyl plank, they're going, yeah, you can use that in your bathroom, where you can run it down the hallway and straight into the toilet, which obviously it can't unless it has a performance solution, because it doesn't meet the DTS provisions. Here's a good example of a representation, my friendly little Siamese cat. Okay, the next part, obviously, that's very important for you guys as architects, is the duties and information that's around that. So we're just going to throw up another poll. That is, what is the primary duty for building products? I'll let teams throw that one up. So what could that be? You can see there, is it to provide installation instructions? Is it to use the product carefully? I'm sure we all have to use our products carefully. Is it to use a fit for purpose product? I'm sure you've seen that definition in the front of the BCA under Part G, or in the old 5.2 bit under the evidence suitability section. Getting a few of the responses back. Contact ABCB, nope. Okay. Almost split 50-50 there between C and E, so ensuring it's not for its intended use. Pretty good. Everyone seems to have a reasonable grasp. So we're moving on to the next bit. We'll go and have a look at duties. So what are the duties? As we describe it, there is a primary duty, the principal thing that everybody must do, and it is a positive duty, and it applies to every person in the chain of responsibility. That is, you've got to make sure it's not a non-conforming building product in simple terms. But have a look at the definition there. So far as reasonably practical for an intended use. Remember the intended use. This is the third part that relates to the executive officers, which they could do by, which they can affect correction by an act or by an omission. Remember, it's a primary duty and everybody must do it. And note, reasonably practical is in there, and that's a defined term under section 74AA. Go and have a look at that so you can see that you are doing the everything that is reasonably practicable. Now, the other parts are giving required information. You lot, as architects, under section 74AG, are specifically nominated to provide required information. So you might want to go and have a look at that in 74AG, the required information's in section 7 there, or subsection 7. So have a squizzy and just get familiar with it. I think most of you are probably already doing it, but just have a read and see that you're doing it all. There's also a requirement to notify the Commission of an NCBP or a suspected NCBP. An example of that might be if you had specified different products, and I'm sure you've all seen on the TV recently, as I have, there's been an ACCC recall for the LG Chem battery and the storage stuff for it. So if you had a product that was a building product and there was a recall issued, even if it was issued through ACCC like that, then you'd be suspicious that that might be an NCBP, and you'd just do a notification. And if you did that, you'd go, look, we've done a notification because of it's had a recall, and this is what we've done about the product. Have a look at the recall provisions under the legislation, because architects are responsible for certain actions and have to help with a recall if one is required. The other thing there is the executive officer must exercise due diligence. So they're imposing the requirement for you to do that. Have a read of what their definition of due diligence is there under 74AI. Next, we'll move on to intended use and required information. Remember, we said intended use is very important. This is the second part, the information pillar. So there's the definition of intended use. Now, this intended use and required information go hand in hand for limitations and conditions of use. A good example of this might be internal lighting. So someone's got gyprock as an internal lighting and they go and whack it on the outside of the house. Is that the intended use of the gyprock? No, the intended use is as an internal lining, so it wouldn't be being used as an intended use. So you have to look at that too. We couldn't consider that to be a non-conforming building product because it wasn't used for its intended use. What would be an example of something that you guys might be looking for as architects? If we use the firewall example that we did before, you'd be looking for the whole fire test or the regulatory information report, and most certifiers and bigger builders out there are actually looking for the whole fire test so that they can have a look at it and then compare it to the installation instructions and make sure they're the same. Remember, the fire test is the evidence of suitability that you're going to use for demonstrating that a product meets the relevant regulatory requirements. Okay, who is in the chain of responsibility? Well, that's simple. That's a person or a company, so the entity. If the person, as it says there, designs, manufactures, imports, and supplies. So who's the designer? That's not you as the architect. That designer would be a person who invents the product. The manufacturer, so if you make a product, you have a responsibility. The one that I see that we will be looking at a lot more in the future is the importers. So if you bring a product in, you have a responsibility to make sure that the product is not a non-conforming building product before you import the product into Australia. And suppliers. Now, supplier could be, have a look at the definition of supply in those defined terms. So the supplier could be obviously the places that you buy products from. It could also be the builder gives the product to the carpenter, the door to install, or the hydrant system for the plumber to put in. So in giving the products. Another example of a supplier could be, mum and dad homeowners who won a lotto, they've gone overseas for a nice trip and they bring some nice taps back from South Africa or something, and they bring them in and say, here, Mr. Plumber, put these taps in for me, please. Has it got watermark? So you'd have to have a look at those sort of things, and that would be a supplier. Here's the bit that they've got to know. They've got to know or ought to know that it's reasonably likely to be associated with the building. So obviously, kitchen tapware that someone's brought overseas, kitchen tapware goes in the kitchen, which is in a building. So you reasonably know that that's going to go in the building. Someone's advertising a cladding to go on for a building and or is offering it for supply because they got it cheap from overseas, or they got seconds and they're offering it to sell it. They know that's going to end up on a building. Person who installs the building product. So that's the person who actually physically does the work, the chippy hanging in the door, the painter painting the walls, or the like. So they have a duty as well. So they've got to make sure that they're asking for the instructions to install a product. So remember the required information that you as architects have to make available or provide. So that's what you're looking for. You've got to pass it down the chain so that the people physically doing the work have the right information. Who else is in the chain of responsibility? Yep, you lot as architects, you're in the chain of responsibility, or the engineer. That is in designing the building by specifying that the product be associated with the building. Now, obviously, architects are you're professionals, and we acknowledge that. Architects are required and expected by the community to specify building products that are safe, meet relevant regulatory requirements, and do what they're represented to do. And the community and the courts expect architects to keep people safe and comply with the NCC and standards. For NCBP part, that's the relevant regulatory provisions. So we've got a couple of court cases here, and these cases highlight the requirements for architects that you've got existing expectations within the community and requirements to exercise due diligence. That's no different than the NCBP laws with the duties. It just reinforces, I believe that the NCBP laws reinforce this principle that already exists, even though it's in our legislation. So this first one, Volley versus Inglewood Shire Council, it's the Shire Hall that's out at Texas. So that's Texas 4385, not overseas in the US. This was a Shire Hall that was designed by an architect, built for the Shire, and it was in relation to the stage that people go up on. What happened was people were up on the stage and the stage collapsed. As you can see there in the notes, and have a read, it's actually quite an interesting little case. Justice Windermeyer in the High Court held a decision that an architect is supposed to be of skilled calling. And I know you are. Look what it takes to become an architect, all the education that you've got to do, your first initial lot of studies, the master's degree that you've got to do, and all the practicing you've got to do, and then to go and become a registered architect. It takes some effort. So they've said, look, you don't have to be perfect. You don't need to be the expert in it. You're not being the brain surgeons of architecture, but you need to exercise due diligence that would be expected of your peers. And that's no different for the NCBP type legislation. The next case, Toomey versus Scalero Construction and others. I'm sure most of you would be aware of this case, and the younger architects among you, or people who have recently gotten qualified, you'd be doing this during your studies. It was a matter that happened down in Victoria, where an up-and-coming VFL player ended up going over a balustrade. What was the issue with the balustrade? Well, it was not designed at the correct height and then not built to the correct height. But how does that relate to NCBP? So Justice Eames in the Supreme Court said that, look, the architect cannot avoid their responsibilities. They've got a duty to do something to make sure that it complies. They can't pass it off to the next person. So like an NCBP, you can't pass it off to the next person in the supply chain. Each person in the chain has a responsibility, and you as architects are in that chain. So my colleagues are just adding, if you're interested in having a read of those two matters, they're just putting that information in the chat for you now. Okay, some case scenarios so that you can try and relate it to different things. Before we go through these case scenarios, I need to note that we can't give out specific details in relation to a case or specific products. And so we've used some generic terminology and phrases to not identify products or participants. So the first one, as I mentioned earlier, would be a residential lift. So this is a lift in a house that was going between ground level and up to the next level. And it came to our attention because someone else in the industry thought, oh, this is a bit dodgy, hasn't got a door on it. I'm concerned that there may be issues. So the Commission carried out an audit of the product, and there was no barrier that would prevent persons falling. Pretty unsafe sort of condition, isn't it? But just thinking of something in a little bit more happy note, the lighter side of lifts, you can get an adventurous lift. Come along and join me at Scouts one day. Back to our case scenario of residential lift. So what happened with it? After we did an audit, we found out that we determined that the product was an NCBP because it was non-compliant and not safe. So it was non-compliant because it didn't have a barrier that would prevent someone from falling out. And obviously, if you haven't got a barrier, that would make it unsafe because they hadn't removed all the risks. Now, just as a quick side note, you can have something that is compliant and is not safe. I'll say that again, let it sink in. You could have something that's compliant, but is not safe. So you've got to make sure you go through and have a look at the definition of safe and have they done everything like that. What was the outcome? The participants offered the Commission an enforceable undertaking to remedy the matter. Now, not all things that could be a possible NCBP will do an undertaking, and some actually get remedied, which is, that's a good thing. Gets fixed up. We've looked at a matter to do with windows, where the windows were in a higher wind area, and they didn't specify the correct pressure. They had a 150 PA instead of a 300 PA, and all the information was there and available, but it wasn't provided down the chain of responsibility so that everybody would get the right product. So when we looked at it, we said, look, hello, that's non-conforming building product, raised the issue with the relevant parties, and they rectified it, which was good. Now, if that window product was put into a different site, it wouldn't be an NCBP, it would be quite okay. So it was only an NCBP for that particular site. So if you're looking for information about the enforceable undertakings, if you go to the QBCC website, and my colleagues should be putting the information in the chat now so you can go straight to it. That's what you need to look for, is on the bottom of the screen there. You can see the lifting, and that's where you'll find the information about the enforceable undertakings. Okay, moving on to another product or product family. So composite decking. So what do I mean by composite decking? The photos down there show you the example. So composite decking is a product that's made using a wood flour and all the glues and resins glued together to make it look like timber and have similar properties to timber, but it's not timber. With this one, it had an intended use that they said that it would provide a long-lasting, low-maintenance alternative to timber, and it's used to create a platform or a deck. The matter we looked at, whilst those example photos there that I took showed decks close to the ground, the ones that we looked at was they were decks close to the ground, they were decks at normal height, deck around a swimming pool, and they even had a few that were used around swimming pools on units. So it was represented to be, as you can see there, lightweight, doesn't split, doesn't rot, all that sort of stuff, maintenance free and covered by a long warranty. What was the result? We found that product to be, that particular composite decking, to be non-compliant, not safe and misrepresented. Why? Because it cracked and warped. There was one case that I became aware of where a young person put their foot through the deck. That's a bit scary, isn't it? They're running around the pool and it split and they put their foot through it. So that could obviously be pose a safety risk to deck users. When you're looking at composite decking, and yes, I'm aware there's a lot of it out there, composite decking is not a building product that has a deemed to satisfy standard. So our code is a performance-based code, so you have to do a performance solution. So for this particular one, there was no evidence of suitability that could be used to demonstrate that it would meet the structural requirements, that it would meet the termite resistant requirements, slip resistance and bushfire requirements. Interestingly enough, that particular one had some information about bushfire, and somewhere in the stuff they gave us it said doesn't satisfy the BEL requirements. So yep, we determined that there was all three items in it because it failed to last the time, didn't have any evidence of suitability to show compliance, and not safe. Now, in relation to composite decking, the Commission, as part of the things we did after that investigation, was we produced a fact sheet to try and assist people, and you can find that on our website. My colleagues are now posting up a link to it, and when you go on the website, that's the one that you are looking for there. Now, whilst I mentioned the thing about the windows and that sort of thing before, or this product here, we don't publish a list of NCBPs. And the window one is a good example. It got fixed. So you wouldn't say, oh yeah, that one by XYZ manufacturer was an NCBP, because the manufacturer, supplier and the builder went away and fixed it. So no need to, I don't believe there's a need to put a list up for that sort of thing. The only time that a list is published is when it's required under legislation. And those things would be if we put to Minister Scanlon for a recall or warning, and she decided, yes, I'm going to issue a recall or warning for that, then the Minister has powers under the Act to do that. Or if there was an enforceable undertaking done, and we've given you the link so you can go and find out about enforceable undertakings that are done. So I encourage you to go away and have a look at the fact sheets and see if that can assist you. You can obviously, if someone's saying, yep, supplier says, oh no, my product's okay, my product's good, I've got everything I need, you could give them the fact sheet like that and say, look, these are questions that the Commission might have for you. Okay, moving on to a third example. So we're looking at structural insulated panels, or SIPs. For those that don't know what a SIP is, here's an example, that photo that's taken from a code mark certificate. So the SIP panels, the one that was looked at for us for this matter was both a wall product and a roof product. And how are the SIPs made? Well, they're generally an injected polyurethane foam that they use between a couple of different materials, either wall cladding, like you can see the one in the photo there's got OSB sheeting. One I looked at had different internal and external wall sheeting, and then that had metal for the ceiling or soffit and the metal roofing. Now, while we're talking about SIPs, think of a couple of ones that you might be aware of. There are quite a few out there already. Think of things like your refrigerated panels. Think of your patios with the insulated panel. Quite a lot of the SIPs get used for roofing in commercial buildings and housing and the like. Now, also for SIPs, there is no deemed to satisfy standard, so you've got to look at it as a performance solution for most of it. For the particular product that we've got here for the example, it was required to satisfy, it was for housing where they used it for roofing and wall, it was required to satisfy the structural, the termite and the waterproofing. Now, so as there's no deemed to satisfy one, they should have had appropriate evidence of suitability that could be used for a performance solution. And we don't obviously assess the performance solution unless it's, say, a code mark, and I'll come on to that one in a second. And you as architects should be very familiar with the waterproofing side of things, because that's been in for a while now. Now, this one happened, resulted in a finding of an NCBP because it didn't meet the relevant regulatory requirements, i.e. they didn't have evidence of suitability for the waterproofing part. They had evidence of suitability that was reasonable for the other things. They didn't have a performance solution for the particular site that was raised as an issue, and they didn't have a generic anything done to say, look, it needs it. These are the sort of processes you'd go down for it as a product to use anyway. There was also no verification assessments done, or no ASNZS 4284, you can do for the testing of facades, where they can either do it in the laboratory or they can do the in situ testing. So why are we using this one, and where does this one lead us? To get one approved, probably the simple way, using the gold mark of evidence of suitability would be code mark certificate. So here's a code mark certificate. And before and we've obviously de-identified all the bits and pieces, and you can see all the things have been changed, so that's not, doesn't say which one it is. Before I go through some of the examples for a code mark certificate and how it might relate to NCBP, I'd like to point out that under section 78 of the building regs, a code mark certificate in Queensland has mandatory acceptance. However, it's only mandatory acceptance to the face value of what's written on it. So if they only covered it for weatherproofing and it needed to be for structural and fire, well, then you'd need other things to cover those things. Just because they've got a code mark certificate for a product doesn't mean that it covers everything that's in the NCC for it. So I'll just show you a couple of relevant bits. And while I'm looking for my pointer here, this particular one you can see is a 2019 one for a SIP product. Interestingly, the item that I chose to use this one for, the company now has another code mark certificate that doesn't have what I'm about to show you on. However, I'm using this one to make you aware of things that we've found out about, just to heads up and ask questions to make sure you're doing your due diligence. So how does a code mark certificate relate to NCBP? Okay, so it has the use of the product. So we can see the use of the product up there. That's the intended use. Quite simple, it tells us what it is. Then has a description of the product. Now, an example for things that we've seen, you might have a product, say the SIP panel, and it says the outside panel is a red in color and the inside is a blue in color. And you get one and they're both purple. You're going to go, does this certificate relate to that product? Am I being given the right evidence of suitability for it, especially if it's on a commercial job and you guys are doing contract administration type inspections? Obviously, the next thing goes, that you're aware of, is it goes through the performance and the DTS provisions that it's deemed to have satisfied. Then the other part that it has, that's part of the required information, is the limitations and conditions. And this is the bit I wanted to speak about for today. So you can have a look there. I'm just highlighting so it tells us the relevant standards, and then it has the weatherproofing part. Now that weatherproofing part, as I mentioned before, you as architects will be familiar, because the NCC up to 2019 version, so from 2017 to 2019, if you did a class 2 to 9 building, mandatory that you had a performance solution for weatherproofing, as there was no weatherproofing deemed to satisfy. Obviously the current version has a couple of items, but doesn't cover everything. So the thing that we were trying to point out for this one is have a look at your limitations. So it's got the weatherproofing, you've got to do the risk, score that they have for the verification method. But the thing that I wanted to point out, and here is the example of the limit straight pressure of not more than 2.5 kPa. So think of, if you're an architect that works north of the tropic in a cyclonic area, or even some of the areas down here that have really, really nice views, or N4s, N5s, they're going to be an ultimate limit state wind speed, so the ULS of more than 2.5 kPa. Think of the, the corner areas. Some of those might be higher than that, and definitely in the cyclonic areas they would be. Does that mean the certificate is no good? No, it's quite a good certificate. But it does mean you'd have to do something else to cover off the ULS for that particular part. So just as a very quick recap, my colleagues are going to whack in a quick poll here. We're going to ask you, what are the features on a code mark certificate, what features would you need to consider? Is it the use of the product, which is the intended use? Is it the description? Is it the limitations and conditions? Or is it everything? Look at that, most people are voting and they'll use smart cookies. It's everything. Well done. Couple of the description of the product, yes. No, all the above. All the above is what we were looking for. Everything needs to be considered. So what happens if you suspect that a product is an NCBP? Remember the example we gave about being recalled for the battery one that's on TV at the moment? You need to refer it to us. Remember, you've got 2 days to do that. How do you do that? You can either email us in information. You can search for notification forms that are available. Just Google QBCC NCBP, and it's about the second or third one every time that I've done it to try and find it for myself. There's a place on the website where you can report an NCBP or safety incident, and that's being put in the chat for you now. We can scan the QR code, which will take you to the relevant bit of the website, and just scroll down a little bit, and you'll see, you'll see our little friend here in their braces and their safety mask and goggles and helmet. That's obviously not an architect. I've never seen an architect dressed like that on site. Must be an engineer. Sorry to my engineer mates. So what information do we want you to include when you give us a notification? You can have a read there, it's all on the screen. Very, very handy if you tell us why you think it's an NCBP. Also to include any of the documents, if someone's sent you an email and says, yes, it can do that, the vinyl plank toilet can go, the vinyl plank can go straight into the toilet, send us the email where they've told that, because they've represented that it can do something that it's not capable of, unless they said it could go into the toilet with a performance solution. And by the way, we've done a fact sheet for the vinyl planks too. So how do you get that to us? You can either fill out the form online and submit it. You can email it to ncbp@qbcc.qld.gov.au. You can also submit them anonymously. If you were dealing with someone and you didn't want to upset a client or upset a supplier, but you wanted to give the commission notification so we can go and have a look at a product, fill it out in PDF form, print it out and send it to us by snail mail. The only disadvantage of that is we're not able to be in communication with you to let you know how the matter is having a look at. And yes, remember the duty to report within 2 days, which is under section 74AL. Okay, that's it that we have for that. Just seeing if anybody has any questions before I give it back to Dan for a minute. If you ever get the opportunity to go into the fire chamber, take the opportunity. I've been. It's well worth it. It makes you think about how your work has an impact on other people. So for me, it was dealing with the fireys. Back to you for questions, Dan.
So yeah, I hope you all got a little bit something out of this day, and I hope the role and duty of an architect in the chain of responsibility has been made a little clearer for you as well. As the saying goes, a chain is only ever as strong as its weakest link. So what we are trying to do is strengthen the chain as much as possible by providing this education to each person in the chain of responsibility. So it's not just to architects, it's not just to engineers, it's going to be to each person. So including importers, suppliers, everyone that we mentioned that's in the chain of responsibility, we are trying to get this information out to them. If we're able to do that, and each person in the chain of responsibility understands their role when it comes to non-conforming building products, what we do and what we create is a pretty strong chain. And a strong chain minimizes everyone's risk and exposure to non-conforming building products. So we've had quite a few questions at registration, which is really, really good to see. The first one up off the bat for you saying, can we send you information about building products so you can help us determine compliance?
Can you send us information about building products for us to help determine compliance? Look, our role as a regulator is to investigate products that may be an NCBP. Unfortunately, as the regulator, we do not provide compliance advice or advice about a product to see if it's suitable for use. That's something you've got to do your own due diligence on. Look, if you're unsure about a product, ask questions of the supplier. point them in the direction of the legislation. Remember, they also have the same positive duty and are in the chain of responsibility. And like you as an architect, in the chain of responsibility, they must do everything that is reasonable to ensure that their products are not an NCBP. And they must provide you with that required information. And that is one of the duties, to provide the required information. If they don't provide it, you can email us, send us the information, and we can go and follow up with that information and let them know that, hello, that's a breach of duty, and then we can look at what actions may be taken. Back to you, Dan. I've got that screen to work for you too, mate.
Yeah, that's perfect. So if everyone, there's a moment there to obviously use the QR code if you get a chance, the email notifications down the bottom, and obviously what information to include in any complaint or notification form that you submit. So I'll leave that on for for the next question, then after that we'll change it to the next slide. Second question for you, Zane. What happens to products already in the market or installed if they are found to be a non-conforming building product?
So what do we do with products that are already out there? Okay, and we found them to be a non-conforming building product. Well, there are actions that the Commission may take, and that's dependent on individual circumstances of each matter. However, these actions could include, the lead one would be prosecution for a breach of duty, which can run concurrently with other things. Interestingly, when they brought out the legislation, they made prosecution the option, and the reason that they obviously did that is the government of the day considered that NCBP is an important matter and that it has to be put to a magistrate to make the decision and decide what the punishment is. The other things are that we can recommend to the Minister, Minister Scanlon at the moment, to issue a ministerial recall or warning. The Commission can issue a direction to remedy the contravention, which could be to take steps from preventing that contravention from continuing. And by contravention, I mean, that something is an NCBP. And what could that be? Those examples, that could be stop selling the product. It could be to rectify a misrepresentation. It could be to provide some complying evidence of suitability. Like if they haven't got anything necessary to support a performance solution, they might have to go away and get that. It could be to identify and remedy products that are already within the market. And the other thing that we do as the Commission is we can provide warning and education to persons in the chain of responsibility, such as this webinar that we're doing at the moment. Back to you, Dan.
Yeah, perfect. I'll get you to switch it to the last slide for everyone.
Roger that.
Yep. Okay, so this was a good question, and one that was asked in a variety of ways. Is there a list of non-conforming building products anywhere so practitioners know not to use these products?
Short answer for that is no. The Commission does not publish a list of declared NCBPs, except where it's, as I mentioned before, where it's required by legislation. So if it was a ministerial recall, a ministerial warning, or a enforceable undertaking. I just had a mental blank there. And then they're the only things that are published. Otherwise, we don't publish it because that could have a detrimental effect on someone who's actually going out and fixing up the things. And we give, nowadays we give people the opportunity to rectify the issue. Yep. And obviously, if it's serious, then you're going to do the recall or warning.
Yep.
And remember, they published in the we publish recalls and warnings in the newspapers on the QBCC website, so that the public can become aware of those things as well. And then for all of the other matters, look, the regulatory powers are generally tailored towards remedying that contravention. So just because we determine that it's an NCBP doesn't mean we should publish the information about that. One of the examples could be someone's offering for sale a roof sheeting product, and they're offering it for sale without saying any other information about it, and they don't have testing for it, for the high-low testing for it to be suitable for cyclonic areas. We might do investigation, find out that's only suitable for non-cyclonic, and they're not giving that required information, and the regulatory action might be remedied by getting them to supply information at a point of sale to say it's only suitable for non-cyclonic. Therefore, that sort of regulatory action would have remedied the breach and the duty and be in balance with the conforming uses that the product has.
Yep. Okay, next question. How far does the definition of a building product go? It seems broad. How do you determine what is and isn't a building product? Is a nail or paint, for example, considered a building product?
Remember what the definition of a building product is under the legislation. Any material or other thing associated with or that could be associated with a building. So yes, very broad definition that it is, but it's important to ensure that the product is something that is or could be associated with a building. Remember, and under the legislation, associated with means incorporated into or connected to a building by carrying out relevant work, which is relevant works defined under Section 5 of the Building Act for those of you who are looking. And so to answer your question, paint would be considered a building product as it's applied to or incorporated into the building. Thus, it's a thing that is associated with the building, so yes, it'd be a building product.
Yep. Do you review and search all new products that are coming onto the market?
I'd like to be able to, but no, we don't. For information for your architects out there, there's only 4 auditors that the Commission has that are doing all this work for the Commission. So we're unable to assess every new product that comes onto the market. When the government of the day wrote the legislation, they framed it as a positive duty. So we rely on people in the chain of responsibility to understand the legislation and ask the right questions and ask for the right information. And then if they're suspicious that something is a non-conforming building product, advising the Commission of such. That way we can go and do an audit or an investigation and then take necessary actions. Remember, it's a positive legislation. So it puts the responsibility back on those in the supply. So yes, the importers and the manufacturers and the suppliers, so go higher up the chain. When you're asking for it, ask for all that information. Remember that chain analogy that Dan used? It's only as strong as the weakest link. So if we all work together in the industry, we can get positive outcomes and try and remove non-conforming building products from the supply chain. And part of that is, the education that we're trying to give and share with you now.
Yep, perfect. Next question. Do any other states other than Queensland have this or similar legislation?
Yes. So New South Wales in December last year introduced a bill to Parliament that's similar to Queensland, but Queensland was the first to implement the NCBP legislation. Both was on the back of the recommendations from the Shergold-Ware report, the 2018 Building Confidence Report. Remember, our legislation was introduced 1 November 2017. So at the moment, there's only 2 states that have got legislation around for non-conforming building products. I know the others are looking at it, and I know our friends across the ditch already have very similar legislation to us.
Yep, perfect. Okay, so this is a good question, and one that's I know a lot of people within the industry are sort of trying to wrap their heads around in relation to EVs. Are EVs and the required charging points in buildings, both commercial and residential buildings, considered building products?
Think of what the definition of the building product is under the Act: any material or other thing associated with or that could be associated with a building. So yes, battery charging system that's associated with a building, remember that is incorporated or connected to a building by the carrying out of relevant building work, would be a building product. So on that basis, the EV and solar charging systems, especially when they are required by the NCC, when you look at the 2 to 9 buildings now and the requirements to provide charging stations, or think of your energy efficiency where you're providing the PV cells and the battery storage systems and that sort of things to satisfy the energy efficiency. Yep, it would be a building product, and the NCBP legislation would apply. But I also note that there might be other legislation that applies, and there could be the 2 of them applying concurrently. One thing that would come to mind for that is obviously, think of the Electrical Safety Act, which you'd have to check with electrical safety officers who are part of the Office of Industrial Relations. It's not our field of expertise, so I can't comment on that one. But remember, all persons in the chain of responsibility must ensure that the required information for the product and how it's safe to be used, so it's not a non-conforming building product, i.e. it's safe, is required to be passed on. And that includes all the installation instructions.
Yeah, well, that was the second part to that question. If something is installed incorrectly, is it still a non-conforming building product?
If a product is not correctly installed as per the intended use and the relevant installation instructions, remember the plasterboard example, it's not the product's fault. That's something that possibly could be looked at as through the defective work process as opposed to an NCBP. One thing we remind you of in the legislation is that required information for correct installation. If something is not installed correctly, that doesn't necessarily make it an NCBP, or should I say, not installed correctly.
Yep. Okay, so the next one, how can stakeholders ensure comprehensive protection in construction projects through effective record keeping and due diligence?
I could do that. I think you've answered that question in the question, through effective record keeping and due diligence. So as an architect, before specifying a building product, ask the right questions. As an example, ask yourself the 3 questions. Is it safe? Is it compliant? Do I have the information to show that it's compliant? And then is the product capable of performing as it's intended or represented to? If you can't adequately answer those questions, you've got that little man talking in the back of the head, or the guts going, that's not right, then maybe you need to reconsider product and look for a different product.
Yeah. Next question. What non-conforming building products to look out for? So I think this is just a broad question. Are there any non-conforming building products out there that architects need to look out for?
If we've issued a warning or recall, yes, but there are no specific products that we can tell you about. Remember, it's a positive duty, and every product must be assessed on its own merit. Is it safe? Is it compliant? Does it perform as represented?
Okay, so the next question we have is, it says the degree of liability and if subject to any direct involvement in specifying. So I think this, what is the degree of liability for an architect if they're subject to directly, specifying a building product is more so what I think that question is trying to ask.
Okay, well, as an architect, yes, you're in the chain of responsibility, and as such, you have a responsibility when specifying a building product. And remember, each person in that chain has that duty or liability to ensure that the building products are not an NCBP. Each person needs to consider those products on a case-by-case basis. Remember, during the presentation, we put forward a couple of cases where the judges have decisions on the things where architects are already expected to exercise due diligence. So this concept should, I would understand, would already be part of your practice anyway. But liability, no, that's for the courts. That's not for us.
Okay, so we've got another question in relation to a register of, so does the QBCC keep a register of non-conforming building products?
No, we don't publish a list of declared products unless we're required to by legislation. Remember, that's only for the recall, warning, or if there has been a product enforcement undertaking offered and accepted. So they're published in the newspapers and on the website, because the intention is to make the public aware so the public know about the products as well.
Next question, is there a precedent for adequate due diligence in selecting appropriate materials / building products?
No, there's no precedent for adequate due diligence. There hasn't been a court case for NCBP yet. And there's no checklist as such to go, yes, if I do these things, I've exercised my due diligence. That's obviously on a case-by-case basis. You'd have to go and have a look at the definition, and it's got the reasonably practical part in there. Have a read of that. As we've said before, look, ask the right questions. Safe, compliant, representation. Just remember those 3 things. Do I have the information? Can I show that it's compliant? You're going to need the evidence of suitability when you are preparing plans for building approval too. Remember, in the Building Act, around section 24, 25, 26, that on face value, you've got to demonstrate how your things comply with the relevant regulatory provisions of the Building Act. So how you're demonstrating that your products have appropriate evidence of suitability. So if you can't do that, you may have to look at a different product again.
Next one up, can you provide advice around engineered stone?
Okay, unfortunately, as the regulator, we are limited in any advice we can give about a specific product. However, keep an eye out for what decisions the government might make in relation to engineered stone. They've published some information already. When thinking about your duties regarding NCBP, think about the safe aspect. Engineered stone would be similar to asbestos. And like you're not allowed to bring asbestos into the country, but there's still plenty of asbestos out there in the older buildings. You just got to be aware of it. Similar sort of principle.
I'm just conscious of time, but I'll get one more in for you, and if people don't mind staying on, we can finish, get it to another potentially 2. What enforcement action does the QBCC take to ensure all responsible parties are meeting their obligations under the legislation?
What enforcement action do we take? Okay, well, we've got several options that are open to us. Our indicative data shows that, and this is the reason that we're doing this sort of webinar, that there are a lot of people out there who still aren't aware of their responsibilities. So we're trying some proactive engagement to raise the level of awareness with parties that are in the chain of responsibility. So we do both proactive and reactive approach. By this, what do we mean? Well, we look at complaints about potential NCBPs and look into those products, but we also are proactive and use statistics that we have in the Commission to investigate product families that might not be correct, and the butterfly effect, getting other people to start talking about it amongst their own industry and getting changes. So as we previously said, look, the actions we can take: prosecution, ministerial recall, warning, directions, stop selling it, rectify it, provide evidence of suitability, and or remedy the product that's already installed in the buildings.
Yep, and I think we've got time just quickly for one more. Why do we allow non-conforming building products into the country?
Why do we allow non-conforming building products into the country? Great question. Okay, so the NCBP legislation, the government of the day brought it in as, when the government of the day brought it in, they brought it in as a positive duty-based legislation. Remember, that includes manufacturers and importers. So that means all people in the chain of responsibility need to understand their duties in the legislation and ensure they comply. It's no different to criminal legislation. I mean, we're all taught as young people not to steal, and they try and do that through education. And as good citizens that are abiding by the rule of law, we know that we're not supposed to do those things. So it's a positive type duty on us. That's why we do education and provide information to all the parties to make them aware of their responsibilities, so that if people bring it to our attention, then we can take action about it. We can't, there's only 4 of us, we can't be everywhere all at once. So when we know, we don't allow them into the country, but if someone brings it in, it's like, a P-plater that gets a V8 and then hops in the car and drives it down the road. They're allowed to buy it, but they're not supposed to drive it because it's out of their license conditions. Similar principle for the NCBP legislation.
Yeah, perfect. I think that does us for time. Thank you all for joining us today and taking your part in the NCBP chain responsibility seriously. If we didn't get to answer your question today, we do encourage you to follow us up. As I advised earlier, you can do that either by contacting your association direct, who may be able to collect these questions and send them to us. We can provide a response and distribute that back, so that gets distributed through to all of you. Or if you feel comfortable, you can contact us direct. Our details are on the QBCC website under the NCBP page. Again, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.